My name is Paul Coyer. I'm a research professor here, and for those of you that don't know, this is not a think tank. We're a graduate school for national security and foreign policy. We got 3 master's degrees and 17 graduate certificates. We are really privileged today to have a friend of mine. I've known him for 8 or 9 years now, Arthur Downey. And how many of you saw Bridge of Spies, Tom Hanks? 1? That's it? 2, 3? Okay. Great movie for entertainment value. Anyway, Arthur Downey actually knows some of the real stories about attorneys and statecraft and espionage and all that sort of thing. He's led quite an amazing life, an interesting career. He is an attorney. He taught for a number of years at Georgetown Law School. He worked in the National Security Council staff in the Nixon White House, served in the Ford administration in the Commerce Department as the head of the Bureau for East-West Trade, which was started as part of the whole détente process, served in the State Department as an attorney, has written a number of books on history, which is one of the reasons why I enjoy talking to him so much as a historian. He's written the one that he's here talking about, the one about attorneys and the Cold War. He's also written an interesting one called the Creole Affair, the slave rebellion that led Britain and the U.S. to the brink of war, and Civil War lawyers, so you can see the lawyers theme. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Art Downey.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul, very much. It's nice that we're a small, informal group, people who aren't dissuaded by the weather. And as Paul said, I'm going to be talking about the role of law and lawyers during the Cold War. You know, during the American Civil War, lawyers ran the show. Lawyers dominated civil discourse. It is no secret, no accident that all of Lincoln's cabinet members were lawyers. All of Jefferson Davis's cabinet were lawyers, except Jefferson Davis. He was a West Pointer. But civil society was dominated then by lawyers. You think we have too many lawyers today? It's a fraction of what the role was like in the middle of the 19th century. So therefore, during the Cold War, the role of law was really not significant at all, but there was some. And it's relevant, and that's what I'll be talking about. It's a very narrow slice. And let's begin with a little background, although, as I said to Paul, I feel very intimidated by folks like you here who know a lot more about this than I think I do. But just to review the Cold War in principle, what happened during this period, when did it begin? If you go back to October 1945, in a little college in Fulton, Missouri, Westminster College, the college president, his name was Frank McClure, had it in his head to invite Winston Churchill to come to Fulton, Missouri to give a speech. How bizarre is that? Turns out, the moral of this particular story is it's really good to have friends in high places. Turns out that he himself was a graduate of Westminster College. So also was Harry Vaughan, his classmate, who happened in 1945 to be President Truman's military aide, General Vaughan. And so Frank McClure travels to Washington to see his friend General Vaughan, explains his proposal, shows him a letter that he's drafted to Churchill, says, "What do you think, Harry?" Harry says, let's go see the boss. So they walk next door to the Oval Office, show it to Truman, explain it. Truman reads it, takes out his pen and writes at the bottom a note to Churchill. As you may know, I am from Missouri, and this is a nice little college. If you agree to come, I will introduce you. Sure enough, as we all know, the following March, Harry Truman and Churchill take a train out to Fulton, Missouri, and we heard his terrific speech from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, and Iron Curtain has descended upon the continent. That's probably, in my judgment, when the Cold War began. That's an easy date for it. It's also possible that the next year, 1947, is a good date for the start, because we had the Truman Doctrine, which was heavy support for Greece and Turkey. We had, in June, Secretary Marshall's speech at the Harvard commencement announcing the Marshall Plan. Others would say, no, it really didn't begin until 1948, when we had the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. I think, and then when did it end? Some would say with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. Others would say, no, the next year, 1990, with the unification of Germany. Others would say 91, with the disbandment of the Warsaw Pact and the USSR. My pick is 46 to 90, 44 years worth of Cold War. You can divide the Cold War in 100 ways. I think the most simple way is in 5 periods, largely a function of who was sitting in power in Moscow and in Washington. Okay? The first period, 1946 to 53. You have just Truman and Stalin for that whole period. You had a lot of activity at that time. You had the creation of NATO, the collapse of the adoption of Eastern Europe by the Soviets, Mao Zedong's victory in China, Soviet explosion of a nuclear weapon in 1949, East German uprisings in 53. Domestically, of course, we have Senator Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare, which tore us to pieces internally. Second period, Khrushchev and Eisenhower Kennedy. That's all. You had the first summit meeting between a Soviet leader and the United States, the first of 23 summits with Eisenhower and Khrushchev. And we later had 3 from Eisenhower, 1 for Kennedy, 1 for Johnson, 3 for Nixon, 2 for Ford, 1 for Carter, 5 for Reagan, and 7 for Bush 1. Also during this period, you had the uprisings in Poland and Hungary, Germany enters NATO, the Berlin Wall was constructed, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, no small event. Third period, 62 to 79. Again, a long period, but we had 5 American presidents and only 1 on the Soviet side. Interesting play. We had Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and only Brezhnev on the other side. We had the Prague Spring crushed by the Warsaw Pact, Vietnam, the beginnings of détente, and the opening to China. The fourth period, 79 to 85, in many ways the most dramatic. Someone's written a wonderful book, and I've forgotten his name, about the pivotal year. I think that's the title. Pivotal year 1979. Think of the cast of characters who walked on the world stage in 79. Margaret Thatcher turned the UK upside down, fixed it. Deng Xiaoping moved into power in China and created what we now see today. Ayatollah Khomeini arrived in Iran. Pope John Paul II arrived in Poland. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and then we had the arrival of Reagan in 81, and on the Soviet side, a mix of very old, ill people, which made it very hard. You had Andropov, former head of the KGB, who lived only 15 months, Chernyenko, who lived only 13 months, and you had, during this period, what many think, as I, that 1983 was probably the hottest year, the most dangerous year, aside from the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the Cold War, where you had the Evil Empire speech, you had the Star Wars in March of 83, the Korean plane that was shot down by the Soviets. You had Able Archer, in November, the NATO exercise that put us about 20 minutes away from nuclear war. Are you at all familiar with Able Archer? It's something to look at. It's a wonderful thing. Actually, there's a marvelous German television movie called Deutschland 83 that describes the issue from the German perspective. In effect, what happened was there had been a conditioning on based in part on Reagan's rhetoric, Star Wars, evil empire, all of this kind of stuff, and Soviet paranoia. And that's a tough combination to put together. NATO was conducting an exercise, a staff exercise, essentially, that would test whether the systems were ready to handle a major war in Europe, including moving through DEFCON 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. From the Soviet perspective, they really thought something was up. They really thought the Americans were going to use this exercise as cover for a first strike, and believed it. And they were beginning to get their missile systems in place to launch. They ordered their aircraft in East Germany to load with nuclear weapons. It was very, very close, as I say, about 20 minutes away from something serious. The last period, 85 to 91, Gorbachev, Reagan, Bush 1, where you had the Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan. Gorbachev repudiates the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine, you recall, is basically the statement that once a country becomes communist, it is an obligation of other communist countries to ensure that they stay communist. So you can march into Prague, you can march into Budapest, etc. One of the other problems with the Able Archer thing was that from the Soviet viewpoint, the KGB had worked for a whole year on assessing how the American system would work to generate a first strike. What's going to happen? And one of the elements was deeper and sudden consultations with the British. Makes sense. And so one of the things in November of '83 the Soviets were picking up was dramatically increased traffic between the United States and the UK. And it happens to be that was when we invaded Grenada. And the sovereign of Grenada, of course, is the Queen. And so there was a lot of traffic, but it had nothing to do with the Soviets. It was about Grenada. Why did you invade Grenada? You're not supposed to do that, et cetera, et cetera. But they picked up the wrong signal, and it was really scary. Anyway, back in the last period, you had the creation of glasnost and perestroika, political and legal and economic liberalization. The Berlin Wall went down in November of '89. Early that evening, a 25-year-old research chemist from East Germany, from East Berlin, cut through the wall and walked down the shops, looked at the shops on the Kurfürstendamm in West Berlin, but then had to get back because she had an early work in the morning, and so she didn't want to miss that. So she went back, of course. That, of course, was Angela Merkel, today the most powerful woman in the world. At the same time, miles to the south on the Elbe River is Dresden, and on the west side of the river, there was the Stasi headquarters and the KGB headquarters. And mobs had ransacked the Stasi headquarters, and that's terrified the 37-year-old lieutenant colonel in the KGB office, who went out front and told the small mob who was heading toward him, "Get out of here! I'm authorized to shoot anybody who dares come onto Soviet territory." That, of course, was Vladimir Putin. So, interesting time. Let's not forget the literature of the Cold War, because we get a good glimpse of society by their literature and periods. George Orwell wrote 1984. Makes sense. Ian Fleming, James Bond, a character of giant strides. Jean Le Carré started his Spy Who Came In From the Cold in 1963, and he's written 23 novels since then, so he's got quite a bag. Tom Clancy's long series, beginning in 1984 with The Hunt for Red October. Did any of you see the movie with Sean Connery, Alec Baldwin, The Hunt for Red October? It's a terrific movie, and I went back and checked it, and the text of The Hunt for Red October, the story, in essence, is a Russian ship captain of a boomer who decides to defect to the United States, and he launches out to sea, and he's going to bring his boat to the United States. And he knows the first step he has to take is to get rid of the KGB political officer on the boat who would prevent him from doing this, who would notify Moscow, etc. Guess what the name Tom Clancy named this political officer, the KGB guy on the ship? Ivan Putin. Is that amazing? And then, of course, we have the Russians, Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago, Solzhenitsyn. They were both awarded the Nobel Prize, but they couldn't come to receive it, so they had to not accept it. We'll look at international law during the Cold War, sort of a brief survey, and we'll focus on Berlin because that's the iconic symbol of the Cold War. That's why it's on the cover of the book. Lenin quoted Marx as saying, "Whoever possesses Berlin possesses Germany. Whoever controls Germany controls Europe." That's why it was so important. In Yalta, in the Crimea, February of 1945, the decision was made to create, I'm sorry, I'm looking for some toys I brought that might show some of these things. You might just pass those around if you would, if anybody's interested. To create the governance, the occupation of Germany. And so 4 sectors, 4 zones were created in Germany, and then in Berlin, separately, Berlin was controlled in 4 sectors. Each of the 4 allies, French, British, Americans, and Soviets, had a sector and had a zone. And in 1949, the Soviets walked out of both the 4-power governance of Germany as a whole and the 4-power Allied Kommandantur, is what it was called, in Berlin for the governance of Berlin. There were 2 exceptions to their absence from the governing structure in Berlin. One was the Berlin Air Safety Center, where until 1991 actually, Soviets, British, French, and Americans sat every day in a traffic control center to control the traffic coming to Berlin in the air corridors. It's quite amazing that that relic of the Cold War stayed all the way through it. The other joint control in Berlin that the Soviets stayed in was the governance and management of Spandau Prison, which was physically located in West Berlin, and that's where the Nazi war criminals were held. They came from Nuremberg to Spandau. And by the late 60s, there was only one prisoner, Rudolf Hess, who had been Hitler's deputy. He was known at that point as Number 7 because it was forbidden to address any prisoner by name. You're one of them nameless people. And so they were given a number as they got off the truck from Nuremberg. And he happened to be the last one who got off the truck. And so Rudolf Hess became Number 7. It was the lawyers who managed that prison. The 3 and the 4-power structure continued, and they managed that prison. And I happened to be one of those lawyers at that time. And we had an interesting experience where we were concerned, the three Westerners were concerned with his health. Not that we liked him, but we had an obligation. He was our prisoner, and we had to maintain his health. And he was living in a cell with stone walls and iron bars. And we wanted to make an arrangement where he could go out into the yard in this huge prison and get some air, get some sunlight. And we went to the Soviets and said, hey, how about it? You know, he's an old man, he's not looking well. And they said, no, he's a criminal. He's a Nazi. So we finally worked out a deal after endless negotiations with the Soviets. He can work outside. We went to Hess and said, look, here's the deal. You go out there, you don't really have to do much work. You just hold a hoe or a hose, and you'll be out in the sunlight. And that's good for you. And he put his nose in the air and said, I am a minister of the Reich. And ministers of the Reich do not do manual labor. I will not take it. Of course, we wanted to strangle him at that point, which was not very nice. The lawyers from the three Western powers had another interesting responsibility, and that was to review all West German legislation that was designed to be applicable to West Berlin. From the West German viewpoint, they wanted Berlin to be incorporated within the Federal Republic of Germany. From our position, our legal position to be in and to get to and from Berlin is based on it being an occupied city, not controlled from Bonn. But on the other hand, we all had an interest in having West Berlin integrate with West Germany. These were the free Germans. And so what was worked out was in Bonn, they would create legislation that they said would be applicable to Berlin. The Western lawyers would sit there and say, no, this law can't be from Bonn, but the West Berlin legislature itself can adopt the identical legislation. So it's Berlin legislation, not Federal Republic of Germany legislation that works here. There were some things, of course, that couldn't work that way. For example, there was military conscription in West Germany to supply the Bundeswehr. But Berlin was an occupied city and a demilitarized city, and therefore there was no German conscription in Berlin. The practical effect of that was that we had a lot of young West German men who would say, where do I want to live? West Berlin, because I don't have to go in the army. How smart am I? And that created some interesting stuff. June of '48, we had the Berlin blockade. Berlin is, I passed that around. Okay. I should have added. One of the joys of the Spandau prison deal was that, as I said, the four powers were responsible for it. And that meant American, French, British, and Soviet troops were responsible for the external security of the prison. Each month, the responsibility moved to another power. And it turns out the Americans handed off every fourth month to the Soviets. And there was nothing as stirring as watching these guys in the courtyard. And both sides always picked the biggest, meanest looking guys we could find. Standing out, 40 on either side, 80 soldiers standing there, transferring responsibility for the military security with flags waving, Soviet flags and irons and sickles and so on. Really quite interesting. 48, we had the Berlin blockade, which was broken by the Berlin airlift, which was an unbelievably enormous undertaking, ended in 1949, where principally the Americans, but also the Brits and the French, moved mostly coal, because most of the time it was in the winter, flew coal, thousands and tens of thousands of tons a day, every minute an Allied aircraft landed or took off from Tempelhof Airport. Just amazing. In '58, we had the first serious Khrushchev crisis over Berlin that continued for years. 1959, President Eisenhower went on television and laid out the legal case. It was that important. We had a good legal case, and he laid it out on television, which was relatively new at the time. And then, of course, famously, we had, in June of '61, President Kennedy met in Vienna with Khrushchev, and Khrushchev threatened to turn Berlin, over to the East Germans. Basically, we're going to walk away from this. You're going to have to deal with the East Germans if you want to get into Berlin. And he listened very carefully that every time Kennedy talked about Berlin, he talked about West Berlin. He never talked about Berlin as a whole, which gave some Soviets a smart idea. And Kennedy was worried. He called in advisors. He called in Dean Acheson from the Truman administration because he was thinking blockade again. Khrushchev was thinking about blockading Berlin. He called in Henry Kissinger. We think of Kissinger as a Nixon guy, but he came in first under Kennedy. And in the next month, Kennedy went on television, just as Eisenhower had done, and spoke about the legal rights, positioned it, so on. And of course, in August, the Berlin Wall was created. Once again, the Americans and the three Western allies were thinking in old terms, in blockade, when in fact the pressure from the Soviet and East German side was because the East German economy was hemorrhaging people. Anybody with half a brain got out if they could, and they could get out through West Berlin very easily. So the East Germans were not so concerned about a blockade. They wanted to wall off the access route, the escape route of West Berlin, hence the wall. They went to the Soviets and said, you've got to do something, create this wall. And then, of course, at the end, we had Kennedy's famous speech, Ich bin ein Berliner. At the wall, we had 500,000 people in front of him talking about that. I knew his German language instructor who was trying to get him to speak German during that speech. I mean, for months he was trying to do that. And she told me that originally there was going to be 3 paragraphs in German, and then 2 paragraphs, and then 1 paragraph, and he just wasn't hacking it. He was a busy guy. And he ended up with that one phrase, Ich bin ein Berliner, which is famous. One of the benefits, an enormous benefit, of Nixon's détente approach that happened to coincide with Chancellor Brandt of Germany, former mayor of Berlin, was the negotiation of an agreement on Berlin in 1971, entered into force the following year, and that settled the Berlin issue that had been festering for a quarter of a century. It opened up Berlin. We recognized the East Germans. Both Germanys entered the United Nations, and the Berlin issue had ceased to become a crisis issue. And then, of course, we know Reagan's speech in '87, Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Let me ask Paul, when should I stop, Paul? I can go on forever, or I can stop in 2 minutes.
No, go ahead for another 10, 15. We got that.
Okay.
Right.
Briefly, let's look at international organizations. There were tons of them created during the Cold War. The most relevant one was the North Atlantic Treaty, otherwise known as the Washington Treaty. And interestingly, the predecessor for the basic concept was an inter-American treaty, which was signed in 1947, called the Rio Treaty. It's a mutual defense treaty. And in Article 3, for the first time in the world, there was this notion. Article 3 of the Rio Treaty says, quote, an armed attack by any state against an American state shall be considered an armed attack against all the American states, and each state undertakes to assist in meeting that attack. It's a unique concept. We think of it as the NATO concept, but in fact, it goes back a little earlier. During that time, in 47 and in 48, the United States was fortunate to have, as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a senator from Michigan, from Grand Rapids, Senator Arthur Vandenberg. If any of you are looking to do some great research project, he needs a biography. This is the time for his biography. He famously said, this is the time when partisan politics stops at the water's edge. We need that today. And he's not well enough known. He was also President pro tem of the Senate, but he was the guy that basically, a staunch Republican, worked intimately with the Truman administration to work out the Rio Treaty, to work out the North Atlantic Treaty, and all these things. Were it not for him, it would have been a very different story. So the North Atlantic Treaty, thanks to him, and the Rio Treaty says in Article 5, an armed attack against one or more of them, the states, the parties, shall be considered as an attack against them all, and each of them will assist the party so attacked by taking forthwith such action as it deems necessary. Article 5 has been invoked once. When do you think that was?
Afghanistan?
No?
In Iraq.
Okay. We just had an anniversary, 15th anniversary of 9/11. That's when it was invoked. The General Council of NATO, a Belgian lawyer, had to figure out, was this an armed attack? And he finally decided those planes were used as missiles, and therefore it was an armed attack. But was it a domestic? We see these issues today, literally. But that's when it was invoked, at the only time. NATO was expanded enormously. When it began in 1949, there were 12 members. We have 28 today. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia in 99, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltics, former Soviet Union collective republics, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, all in 2004, Albania, Croatia in 2009, and of course, the Russians today. This is not something that is a brand new idea. In Moscow, believe or assert that promises were made by the Americans and the West generally at the time of German unification and the resolution of the issue of whether a unified Germany could be a member of NATO or not. Promises were made that NATO would not move to the east. And they have. They're in the Baltics, they're in Poland, they're in Romania. And therefore, you Americans and everybody else broke your promises. That's another area for some good research paper. There's been a lot done recently, but more needs to be done on that topic. Nobody's found a piece of paper that made that promise. And there's no treaty document that made that promise. But it's a serious issue today, whether or not. You know, at the time of German reunification, the issues were, well, should, you know, the Soviets said, okay, we can buy German reunification, but it must be neutral. It can't be a member of NATO. Then the second round was, all right, can be a member of NATO, but also a member of the Warsaw Pact at the same time. Well, that wasn't going to work. Then they said, okay, it can be a member of NATO, but German NATO forces can never be into what is now East Germany. And ultimately, the deal was cut that it can be in NATO as a unified Germany. And as I say, today they're saying that was a deal that you wouldn't let NATO move to the east, and you did. So that allows us to play around on our turf in Georgia, in Ukraine, and maybe the Baltics. It's scary. Briefly, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which really begins the year before, when Eisenhower, in March of 1960, Eisenhower authorized the training of Cuban exiles in Guatemala for a possible landing in Cuba near the mountains, so that if the landing failed, they could move into the mountains and survive as guerrillas, just like Castro did. And then we had the following year, March of 61, Kennedy authorized the invasion. We had the Bay of Pigs, which was a different location and no air cover. It was a debacle, a disaster. And so the following year, Cuba and the Soviet Union agreed that the Soviets would install missiles, medium-range missiles, in Cuba. Why? Well, you had Khrushchev assessed Kennedy in that meeting in Vienna as being weak, and that he absorbed the creation of the Berlin Wall, took no action against it. So he's weak, so I can make this big step. He also said, I'm really worried that Kennedy, after the failed Bay of Pigs, that Kennedy might really invade and crush Cuba. And I can't have that. I would be the laughingstock of the communist world. And remember, exactly at that point, he was under enormous pressure from the Chinese as being a weak softy. You're out of the movement. Third, he also knew that the United States held a 17-1 strategic nuclear missile advantage over the Soviets, an enormous thing. So you put nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, you change that dynamic immediately on the cheap. So that's a big plus. Khrushchev later joked that he also was very concerned because from his dacha on the Black Sea, he could look across the Black Sea and see the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. And he really wanted those out, and this was the way to get them out, through Cuba. In October 62, our U-2s spot the missiles in Cuba. That starts this flurry of activity, the so-called executive committee that met around a table at the White House day and night for days and days. Those sessions were taped secretly. Only the president and the attorney general knew they were taped. They make marvelous reading. There's 600 pages of the transcript of those tapes, which are very interesting to go through. You see where all the players were and what they were doing. Early on, of course, you had, especially the folks in the military, we have to have air attack and an invasion. And we have to do it right away before these missiles become operational, or we'll never be able to do it. And then we're stuck with a fait accompli. Then Atchison was there at that point. And then finally, the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, and George Ball from the State Department, a great international lawyer, said, let's try something short of that. Let's try a blockade. Then, pardon me, because if we invade and have an airstrike, what will the Soviets do? They'll take Berlin, or they'll go after Turkey and our missiles there. And that's a NATO country, and we'd have to respond. We could have a mass nuclear war. Can't do that. So they started to focus on blockade. And then finally you get people like Dean Rusk, who was not a lawyer, although he later, after he left office, was a professor at the University of Georgia Law School. He liked the idea. Rusk said, you know, it's really not a blockade, it's something less than that. And we need to get support for it through the Rio Treaty, the treaty that I mentioned early on. And if we could get a 2/3 vote to support us, that would be enough to make this valid under international law. Then Llewellyn Thompson, who had been our ambassador in Moscow, was the only guy in the room who knew Khrushchev very well. He said, you know, this sounds weird, but Khrushchev really is impressed by legal argument. If you can show him that what you're doing has a solid legal basis, he'll buy into it. So finally, the acting legal advisor of the State Department, Len Meeker, said, what we really need is something called a defensive quarantine. A blockade is an act of war, and we can't impose a blockade. We need something less. And then they ran off to the OAS to get a vote, to get the 2/3 vote, and it turned out it was a unanimous vote. And fortunately, it all worked out. President Kennedy went on television, explained we were instituting the defensive quarantine. It worked, and it was resolved amicably, where the Soviets withdrew their weapons, and the United States pledged it would never attack Cuba. That was Khrushchev's main worry. The Soviets said they would not in the future introduce offensive weapons. That was tested for decades ahead. And the United States agreed privately, the Attorney General to Ambassador Dobrynin, that we would remove the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. That was the deal. Amazing story, with some interesting role for lawyers. I'm concerned about our time. Let me just mention very briefly one pure legal international law issue that arose during the Cold War. It was hardly the hot seat of the Cold War, but when the Sandinistas took over Nicaragua, and President Jimmy Carter welcomed the Sandinistas, had President Ortega come to Washington, and the Nicaraguans hired an American lawyer, a senior lawyer who would help negotiate the Panama Treaty Reversion Agreement, because the Nicaraguans and the Panamanians, General Torrijos, said, you need a Washington lawyer to fix everything. That was Bill Rogers. And he hands off the representation to a young associate who happened to be Spanish speaking. And his job was to run around the United States and litigate to return to the government of Nicaragua assets of the government that were stolen by the Somoza regime. Okay. Then Reagan comes in. The law firm says, we don't think we want to represent Nicaragua anymore. You'll have to leave this guy. His name was Paul Reichler, the young lawyer. And so he had a personal dilemma. Do I stay with my client or do I leave the firm? He decided to leave the firm. Went with another firm, took the client with him. Compressing this, it's a very long story. But he said to them in the early 80s, look, you're getting beat up by the Contras. It's really a mess. I think what we need to do is bring a lawsuit against the United States in the World Court. Now, some years before, when the Iranians took over the American embassy in Tehran, we brought a case at the World Court and won. And so the Americans were saying the World Court is really a great hot dog. They do the right things, and that's great. So Paul Reichler says, let's go to the World Court. The Cubans and the Soviets told the Nicaraguans, that's a dumb move. The Americans control the World Court. And so that's a waste of time. Paul Reichler says, no, look, I don't think we can win the case, but I want, by just filing the case and having it accepted, we can change enough votes in the House to end aid to the Contras. And that's what we were, smart lawyer. That's what we really want to do. So the Nicaraguans say, okay, let's do it, file it. Paul Rako then goes and hires Abe Shays, Harvard law professor, international law, former general counsel of the State Department, as part of his team. So on. They're over in Paris, about to negotiate, and then everything falls apart because the firm says, no, we can't represent these awful Nicaraguans against the United States. He ends up going on his own, starts his own law firm, takes the case, files it, and wins. World Court, what's the exact vote? I forgot. 12-3. The United States, you may recall, had mined the harbors in Nicaragua and so on. The World Court said, United States, you violated international law. Full stop. That case was a case of a small country against a superpower brought by a lawyer of the superpower. Have we had anything since that recently? Let me tell you. South China Sea, in the past few months, and where you had the Philippines bring a lawsuit in The Hague against China, who had made historical claims against the South China Sea, and he won. So we had a small country against a superpower, and guess who that lawyer was? Paul Reichler, the same guy who did the Nicaraguan case in the World Court. All right, I think I'll stop. If anybody wants to talk about the Bridge of Spies, that's an interesting movie, and we can talk about that. And we can talk about the economic Cold War, if you'd like. I forgot to mention, during the Spandau governance of the four powers, each power who was in charge for the day, for the month, hosted a lunch at the prison. Very elaborate lunch. Everybody wanted to attend French month. Nobody wanted to attend British month. This is a copy of the actual menu during French month. So you see why the French
They passed it around already.
Oh, you passed it around already. Good. All right. So, yes.
The South China Sea, China said they want to buy money. So, what are the
Just like the United States said.
That's right.
what are the consequences?
What are the consequences? Well, as you know, the courts don't have armies. But it fundamentally undercuts the ability of the Chinese to proceed on a broad front, claiming we are protecting what is legitimately ours, because they have no serious claim to legitimacy. Their whole basis was historical, and the court said, sorry, a unanimous court, which is really extraordinary. Yes.
If the court decides what they decided, what happened to the other claimants? Can they still use the common waters to fish?
Oh, yes, that the other claimants were not parties. And this focused narrowly on the Philippines, saying China has no right to claim sovereignty over waters that we think are our sovereign. And the court went with it. Extraordinary. But to think that it's the same young lawyer who handled the Nicaragua and won the Nicaragua case against the United States, and he won this one 12-0, which is quite amazing. Reichler. Paul is his first name. And he's a Washington lawyer. He lives on K Street. And Reichler. Reichler. First name Paul. I emailed him. He was in The Hague when the China case came down. I said, well, way to go, Paul. How did you manage that? So it's a good one. Questions? Other questions? There'll be a test.
I have a question. I have lots of questions because it's a very intriguing spectrum of history.
Well, it's a narrow slice. As I say, the lawyers and the law played a relatively small role, but not completely insignificant role.
Yeah, but your presentation was very comprehensive. So, but I have a very specific question, which has bothered me many years. and I don't know if it's answerable. It had to do with bad pigs. And one of the highlights of the Cold War was the disastrous destruction of the invasion force. Kennedy has always been alleged to be the culprit by withholding air power. But what's always confused me is this was an Eisenhower CIA operation which had been planning, and it was 3 months into Kennedy's administration.
But as I said, it was planned at a different location, and I think with air cover.
But my question is, if Kennedy, who had the power to authorize or veto, authorized it and gave the green light, what on earth did he deny air power to the operation that he approved for in the first place? Was he trying to defeat the invasion, or was air power an irrelevant? As I said, it's probably difficult, if not impossible, to answer.
And I don't have an answer, but my hunch is a big factor was a worry that an American plane and pilot would be shot down and be paraded in front of the world. Remember, just in the back of his mind was Francis Gary Powers the year before. And everybody had assured Eisenhower with that U-2 flight, hey, he's going to be flying so hard that even if the Soviets shoot at him, the plane will disintegrate and the body will disintegrate, there'll be no body, literally. And so therefore, the first announcement was, because they were so sure the Soviets had nothing, a weather plane went down. Well, that just was a further humiliation when they produced Francis Gary Powers and purchased the plane. And I think that was in Kennedy's mind, that I just can't have our pilots paraded around Cuba, and they wouldn't do it. Shortly after that, he invited Eisenhower to talk with him, Kennedy did, after the Bay of Pigs. And Eisenhower said, look, when you made your decision, did you sit around the table and have all the players in the room and ask them each one what their view was? And Kennedy said, no, I really didn't do that, which was a serious problem. That was a problem that sort of management, how you make decisions, that Dean Acheson pointed out about his time in the Truman administration and then his frequent appearances in the Kennedy administration, where he said, here you had Truman, a non-lawyer, but sort of instinctively understood sort of a quasi-judicial process approach. When you have to make a major decision, you get all the players who have an interest in that issue, get them around the room, in one room, make sure they each have an opportunity to speak and to comment on somebody else. That's the only way you make a good decision. And then, Acheson said, he goes into the Kennedy meetings, and it's college fraternity free-for-all. There's no order, there's no process, and that is not the way to make a decision. So that's my hunch, that the reason Kennedy withheld the air cover was because he didn't want Francis Gary Powers trotted around Havana.
Surely there must be other questions, yes.
Is the outcome of the Cold War seen as a confirmation of the wisdom of Kennan's containment suggestion?
I haven't had that question before. This is Judge Hoya, who knows a good deal about this stuff. Probably. You were careful to phrase the result as the outcome, whereas too many people refer to it as the victory of the United States over those stupid Russians. And it's that attitude that is around in some places that fosters, that permits Putin to go out there and say, we've been wounded by those awful Americans. They're out dancing on the grave, and we have to retaliate. We have to get back to them. But I think that's probably correct, that George Kennan's long telegram and the containment ultimately worked. Though in varying degrees, you had, early on, you had a lot of rhetoric about rollback. Let's roll back the communist horde. And then you had the revolution in Hungary and elsewhere, or the riots in East Berlin. And everybody was saying, well, now's the time, send the American military, at least drop weapons. It sounds like Syria. Drop weapons or do something. And Eisenhower was pretty good about that. He said, no, it's awkward, but we can't do that. That would involve us too much. Let's contain it, even though some would say we had encouraged Hungarians to move over into Austria and so on. Good question. Any other questions? But speaking of the Bay of Pigs, one last point. With respect to the Bridge of Spies, the lawyer there, Jim Downey, I wish it had been highlighted in the movie, but in 1962, while that was going on, while he was freeing or exchanging powers and Colonel Avery, he was also in Cuba negotiating with Castro. He brought a son down there to go snorkeling with Castro. And he was so
I think that was in the blurb at the end, not the snorkeling part.
But they should have said more. He was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and some Cubans were saying, this is like the Japanese diplomats who came to Washington in December 1941, and it's a smokescreen. They're really going to invade, they're going to drop nuclear weapons on us, and so on. And it's just unbelievable that he was doing that at the same time, and he was also running for the United States Senate from New York at exactly the same time. And he lost to Senator Javits by 100,000 votes. Interesting story. Anyway, well, thank you all. If you have any more questions, let me know.
Well, I would just say one of the neat things about doing a PhD in Cold War history, by the way, art was one of my sources for my dissertation, was the chance to talk to people who had lived it. And I remember, I don't know if you ever met him, there was Sergo McCoyan, Anastas McCoyan's son, lived in Moscow half the year, he's passed away now, and in Vienna, Virginia half the year. And I met him at a Cold War history conference in Budapest in 2003, and he hosted me for a dinner together with another old American Cold Warrior from the Rand Corporation later on that summer. And he had all these photographs of him and his father with these at these hot points in history. One of them was him standing next to a missile battery in Cuba in October 1962.
Wow.
It's kind of neat to see.
Oh, absolutely. Really scary.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming in. And you've stopped waiting.